Hello, and welcome to Judges Lesson 10, and we're going to cover Judges 10 today. Today we are talking about, what's interesting is that this is another one of those episodes in between the major judges. We had one between, if we go back, we look at between the major accounts of Ehud and Deborah Barak, the Deborah Barak class, or the Deborah Barak grouping. We have that very short account of Shamgar that's mixed in between. Well, here we also have in between Abimelech and the next major judge, which is Jephthah. We have two, and the two that are here are Tola and Jair. And so these are the two that we're going to talk about today. This is kind of a shorter story, and we will begin moving into the Jephthah story, but only very briefly. Next week will be the major story about Jephthah. But as we begin today, we look at Judges chapter 10. But as is expected and is custom and as it should be, let me open us with some prayer. Most gracious and loving God, we thank you for the opportunity today to study your word. Watch over each one of us as we individually study, look at your word, find meaning and understanding and wisdom in your word, and help us in our to guide us in our lives as we move forward in that. And in all things we thank you and we praise your name. Amen. So, one of the other interesting, before I actually get into this, one of the other interesting things in this is that that these next two, which is Tola and Jair, both of these are, they judged Israel. Unlike Shamgar, who is only said to have saved Israel, these two judged Israel. And so there's a slight difference between how these two stories, or these two judges, and the previous minor judge, Shamgar. In our, what's interesting is between Abimelech here, the story we just had last week, and next week, and then after Jephthah, between Jephthah and Samson, we will have three short or minor judges, and that'll be Ebzan, Elon, and Abdon. And so we have Abimelech, and then we have these two, Tola and Jair. Then we'll have Jephthah, and then we'll have three, which is Ebzan, Elon, and Abdon, and then we will have the story of Samson, and then we'll talk about what happens after Samson. So that's kind of how we do that. So we have one, Shamgar. Then here we have two, Tola and Jair. And the next sequence, which is I think around chapter 12 or so. In fact, it is in chapter 12. We have Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. So we'll have the other three. Okay. That's kind of, we have these five minor accounts, actually six if we count Shamgar. We have one of the interesting, well, I guess what the purpose of these is that they kind of, they accelerate the view that there is a decline in how they are dealing with Adonai, with God. That the interlude, the minor judges in between, actually progress the story faster than the major judge. And so we'll have, it's like if we go back to Abimelech, we see he only reigned, he only brought peace, or only brought a momentary relief between problems of 3 years. And then as we move forward, we see that these minor judges actually have much longer periods of time where they judged Israel. And so they progress the story faster than the major judges. What we also see is that their progression is also quickly moving them away from Adonai and toward these foreign gods, as we'll see as we move forward with our story today. So, picking up now with Judges chapter 10, beginning with verse 1. After Abimelech, Tola, son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, who lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim, rose to deliver Israel. He judged Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried at Shamir. Okay, so our first one here is Tola. Tola means worm. And so one of the things that I have noticed, and maybe you have also noticed, is that as we move through these stories, that a lot of these characters have, a lot of the characters we meet, a lot of the story, where the story is centered around the person, they have a name that in some way is either indicative of who they are or have a meaning that is not very complimentary, even though we don't hear anything about why this person has a very uncomplimentary name. Tola, the one we're talking about now, who's the son of Puah and the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, his name means worm. And so we find out here that Tola, who means worm, he's the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, a man of Issachar. Well, Dodo was one of Issachar's sons, and so he's from the clan of Dodo, and his father's name is Puah, and his name is Worm, or Tola. And what's really strange about this is that he is the judge, and he has settled himself in the town of Shamir, which is in the territory of Ephraim. And again, Ephraim is supposed to be the senior tribe. That is the son of Joseph, who was anointed by or blessed by his father, and he is supposed to be the leader tribe. Ephraim's tribe is supposed to be the leader tribe. And yet we see that they are not in the leadership position. This time it is a man from the tribe of Issachar. Now Issachar is not that far away and from the territory of Ephraim, and Shamir is located inside the territory of Ephraim. So Tola rules all of Israel, but he's from the tribe of Issachar, which was not one of the chief tribes. And so that's kind of an interesting little twist here, that although he's ruling from a town inside of Ephraim, the capital, or the leading tribe, he is not from that tribe. It tells us he judged Israel for 23 years, and then he died, and he was buried there. So we move forward from 3 years under Abimelech, where he ruled, where now we move to Tola, who judged, and he judged for 23 years. So we move forward 23 years. What this suggests also is that there was 23 years of relative stability also during this 23 years. There's no mention of any sort of hostility from other peoples around them. They seem to be settled and at relative peace here for 23 years. And that's kind of telling in itself, is that although they seem to be at relative peace, what we know is that although it appears that they're living in a peaceful moment, what's really happening is their further decline into idolatry, further decline into worshiping of other gods. And we will see that shortly after we are met by our next character, who is Jair. Beginning now with verse 3 of chapter 10. After him came Jair the Gileadite, who judged Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 towns, which are in the land of Gilead, and are called Havoth Jair to this day. Jair died and was buried in Camel. we know who Gilead is. Gilead is from the tribe of Manasseh. He was Gilead was one of the leading tribes out of the tribe of Manasseh, and the son Jair, not this Jair, but the man that Jair here is named after, which would have been his grandfather, or maybe even his great grandfather. It's possible, but it was probably his great grandfather, was named Jair, from the tribe of Manasseh, and the Jair that is the son of Manasseh was given a territory where he had 30 towns. And Jair, the name of the town, or the name of the region, or the name of the territory is called Havoth Jair, which means the tents of Jair. And so when Manasseh was given this piece of territorial land, which is on the western side of the Jordan, and so it's not necessarily inside of what would be considered the promise. The promise begins at the Jordan, eastward. And so they're on the western side of the Jordan, not necessarily in the promised land, but this is a land that has been allotted to them. And they built 30 towns. And those 30 towns were known as the tents of Jair, the Havoth Jair. And that's what it's called to this day, as far as when the story was written. The tent settlements of Jair is where he begins. And this is a descendant of that original Jair. And what we see here is that he begins to judge Israel, and he judged Israel for 22 years. Just like Tola, who had 23 years of relative stability, we also have that in Jair. There is about 22 years of relative stability. Now what's interesting is that, one of the things we need to notice in this is that he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 towns. 30, 30, 30. And again, Havoth Jair is supposed to be 30 settlements known as the tent settlements of Jair. And what we need to note about this is that these 30 sons rode on 30 donkeys. Where Tola is strictly, in the previous one, Tola, in every way he is just a judge. Here Jair has 30 sons, and they act more like they're princes, and he is a king, than they are judges. The 30 sons ride on 30 donkeys. That means that they have wealth. There are also donkeys in the hill country of Ephraim, which is where this is taking place. Or in the land of Gilead, which is in the hill country of Ephraim. The territory there is much better suited for warfare using donkeys than with horses. Donkeys would have a better advantage in the hill country because of the difficulty of traveling in this hill country. And so that tells me, what it tells us is that not only were they wealthy, that they had 30 donkeys, but they were also militarily wealthy, in the fact that they had donkeys, which would have been used in warfare, or which had been used in battles. They also had 30 towns, which means they ruled over the 30 towns of the Havoth Jair, the tents of Jair, or the tent settlements of Jair. So, in many ways, Jair and his sons are acting as if they were a monarchy again. And so we're shifting from Abimelech, who was trying to be a king, to Tola, who was just a judge, to Jair, who's a judge, again trying, or at least in some ways filling the role of a king, which is just kind of interesting. I want you to also note that there is also a similarity here between Jair and the sons of Jair and the son of David. In the story of Absalom gathers himself some troops, and he does it by seating them on donkeys. And again, so we have the idea of the donkeys representing military power, military strength. Okay, so Jair is the judge, and it looks like he sets himself up more or less like a monarch again with his sons. And he rules for 22 years. He dies, and he's buried in the town of Kamon, and they have no idea where Kamon is. As we move forward into the next section of this, which is the story of Jephthah begins here with the next with this next section here, with beginning with verse 6 here. However, we will not meet Jephthah until the chapter 11. But this is the setup for what's going to happen. One of the things that we need to see in this is that there is a structure that matches previous structures in how the book is put together, or how the story is put together. There are these elements are part of this. There's Israel's sin, what they have done wrong, Adonai's discipline, what does God do about this? Israel cries out to God. Adonai delivers through a deliverer. Israel gets a chance to rest, and the deliverer dies. That's what we're going to see. We saw that with Deborah. We saw that with each one of these elements of the major prophet. And so here we have a major prophet coming up, Jephthah, and those elements of the story are all part of this story. The first three elements of that, which is Israel's sin, Adonai's discipline, and Israel's crying out to them, comes up in the introductory notice here as we're moving forward, and then the last two elements of that are found at the conclusion of this, in the concluding notice, as we move forward. One of the unique plot elements of this particular story is that it is God's prophetic word breaking into the account, but unlike Gideon or Barak in the past, or Samson, which comes up in the future, Jephthah receives no visitation from God, nor does he receive a prophetic word. And so there is a difference. This is just further evidence that they're in a downward spiral and away from Adonai, and headed toward what we will see in the not too distant future in the stories. So, picking up now with verse 6. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, worshiping the Baals and the Astartes, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. Thus they abandoned the Lord and did not worship him. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the Ammonites. And they crushed and oppressed the Israelites that year. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites that were beyond the Jordan, in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah and against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was greatly distressed. So what we discover is that the Israelites again have fallen away from God. We knew this already, but now it is spelled out for us. Here is what they have done wrong. They've worshipped the Baals and the Astartes, the Asherahs, the Asherah poles. The Astartes is a different word, but it means exactly the same thing. It's the same thing as the Asherahs, the gods of the Aram. The gods of the Canaanites around them, which is the Baals and the Astartes, or the Asherahs. And they also have started incorporating worship of the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, and the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. So they have completely abandoned Adonai as their God, and they're not worshiping God whatsoever. So God's upset by this. Adonai is upset, and so he rises up enemies against them again. And this time it is a much more persistent enemy. The Philistines and the Ammonites. The Ammonites are east moving west, pushing against Manasseh and the tribes that are outside on the other side of the Jordan, the western side of the Jordan. And the Philistines start pushing in from the east, from the coast, from the Mediterranean coast, pushing east. And so first off, they have the Ammonites pushing them up from the east, pushing west, pushing west, and that, of course, that's a problem. And then the Philistines jump in also. So when they say the Ammonites, they're really talking a lot about all of these different nations kind of joined together. The Moabites, the Sidonites, the Aramites, they all kind of are all together. And one of the things that we need to recognize in this, or that the writer of the Judges wanted us to understand, was that the further they got away from God, and the more influence these foreign gods had over them, the more likely they were to become under the rule of these foreign people. If the God of the Ammonites is so powerful that Adonai, the God of the Israelites, is pushed down or out, then the Ammonites become more powerful. Remember, we need to recognize that the peoples of this time recognize that a God of this place, this valley here, is not the same God that's the God of that valley over there, or that hill up there, or that mountain back there, or this other place. That each location, each nation, each peoples had their own gods that they worshipped, and the more powerful the nation, the more powerful the God. And so as the Israelites become oppressed, they're being oppressed by the gods that they should not be worshiping. And so the people that owns those gods, the people that recognize those gods as their God, become more powerful and start oppressing the Israelites. So as they move forward, they start an oppression that lasts for 18 years before the Israelites start becoming upset by this. So the Ammonites cross the Jordan, and they start pushing even further. So they've moved past Manasseh, they've moved past those tribes that are on the western side or on the eastern side of the Jordan, and they've moved into the western tribes, Judah and Benjamin and Ephraim. And so not only are the Ammonites pushing from the east, pushing from the west, are pushing from the east, moving into the promised land from the east, moving into the west, but also the Philistines on the western coast are pushing in also. And so they're being squeezed from both sides, including, and this is the three, and we note here that Judah, which also encompasses Simon, Benjamin, which stands between the two northern and southern tribes, and the house of Ephraim, which would include all of the 10 northern tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh, Zebulun, Asher, Gad, Dan, and I know I've left out a few. So that's what we're seeing here, is that the entire nation is now under distress. Picking up now with verse 10. So the Israelites cried to the Lord, saying, "We have sinned against you, because we have abandoned our God and have worshipped the Baals." And the Lord said to the Israelites, "Did I not deliver you from the Egyptians, and from the Amorites, and from the Ammonites, and from the Philistines? The Sidonians also, and the Amalekites, and the Moabites oppressed you, and you cried to me, and I delivered you out of their hand. Yet you have abandoned me and worshipped other gods. Therefore I will deliver you no more. Go and cry to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them deliver you in the time of your distress." And the Israelites said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you, but deliver us this day." So they put away the foreign gods from among them and worshipped the Lord. And he could no longer bear to see Israel suffer. So the Israelites, once again recognizing that they have walked into sin, that they have abandoned the God that has loved them all of this time, they cry out they cry out against themselves and for God, and saying and acknowledging the fact that they abandoned God and started worshiping the Baals. God isn't quite finished yet scolding them. And God then scolds them. Did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and from the Ammonites and from the Philistines? Haven't I already done this before? I mean, we can go back to the story of Ehud and the story of Barak and Deborah, and we could go back to those stories, and we can see that yes, God has already delivered them from these peoples. He also then goes on. He's also I delivered you from the Sidonians and the Amalekites, and some of your texts may say the word Maonites, Maonites. Most scholars believe that this is actually a transcription error, and it should be the Moabites, not the Maonites. And the Septuagint, the Greek translation of this, actually picks that error, or takes that error out and puts on the word Moabites instead of Maonites. And so I'm going to go ahead and use the Moabites because it makes much more sense to me. I've never heard of the Maonites, but I have heard of the Moabites as being the enemy, being one of the enemies of Israel. And so God goes on to say, I also delivered you from the Sidonians and the Amalekites and the Moabites as they oppressed you. You cried out to me, and I delivered you out of their hands also. And yet in me doing all of that, you still abandon me and worship other gods. Therefore, I'm not going to step in anymore. I am not going to deliver you. Go and cry to these other gods who you've chosen. Let them deliver you in your time of distress. Remember, they truly believed at the time that the God of this place or the God of that place had more power than any God they could bring with them. And yet God is telling them, you've abandoned me, and I am more powerful than all of them. I could save you from your distress in this, but I'm not going to. Go turn to those gods and see if they will deliver you. Don't come to me. But the Israelites recognize that this is not going, that won't work for them, because it's these other gods that are actually oppressing them. It's these other gods and the people that recognize those gods that are actually oppressing them. And so they turn back to God again and ask God, and say to God, we have sinned. In fact, we ask you to do whatever it is that would seem good to you to do. So it is out of our hands. We're putting it back on you, God. We want you to you deliver us. Please deliver us this day. And then they take the further act. Now we see something very similar to this way back when we have the story of where Jacob, when he finally gets rid of the foreign gods that are part of his household. Remember when he left his uncle Laban, his wife took his Rachel had taken the idols of her father with her and had put them in her saddlebag. And when they got to the promised land, when they finally arrived back in, Jacob took all of these foreign gods and he buried them. And that's what the wording in this, although it doesn't sound like it to us in English, in the original, in the Hebrew, this is they buried the foreign gods from among them, and they started worshiping Adonai again. And so God could no longer bear to see Israel suffer. Now, I want you to know that the way, again, the phraseology of that God could no longer bear to see Israel suffer is that this is an internal struggle with God. We need to recognize that the phraseology of this in the Hebrew means that this is actually an internal struggle with God. This isn't an external struggle that God, okay, I just can't deal with watching all of this happen. Instead, it is God could not feel this any longer. He couldn't bear to have this happening any longer, and it was causing God to suffer because his people were suffering. And so this is an emotional statement from God. And that's kind of an interesting little twist to this, is that we don't see very often where God has that kind of, where it affected the internal parts of God. The Spirit of God even was troubled by this, putting it in other words. Moving forward and picking up with verse 17. Then the Ammonites were called to arms, and they encamped at Gilead. And the Israelites came together, and they encamped at Mizpah. The commanders of the people of Gilead said to one another, "Who will begin the fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." So, the Ammonites gather up their troops, and they encamped in Gilead. What we need to see here is that this is all taking place on the outskirts or on the edges, again, of the valley of Jezreel. Gilead is on the edge of the valley of Jezreel, and again, this is all taking place in the center, in the heart of the entire northern territories. And so, and the valley of Jezreel plays that important role again. This time it's on the edge of it, but it is still in the same general area. And so the Ammonites come in, and they build up their forces, and they start encamping in Gilead. The Israelites come together, and they encamp in a nearby place called Mizpah. This is not to be confused with the Mizpah, where Jacob and his uncle make an agreement between them, between the two of them, that this Mizpah means to watch between the two. And so this is a different Mizpah. This is not the same one. The other Mizpah is in a whole different location. So this is a different Mizpah, but other than that, but it also means that place of where we have come to an agreement. And so here's where they come together, and they encamp in Mizpah. So the Israelites then, after they've encamped here, they start talking to one another, and what they do is they say the same statement that is done several times. The first time this statement is made is way back in Joshua's time, and he asks, "Who will go up and lead us into this battle?" And each time that they said, up to this point, each time that was said, the response was, "Judah will lead us." But this time the question is asked, who will begin the fight against the Ammonites? And then they go on to say, "He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Or this person, whoever it is, will be the new leader, will be the new judge, will be the chief of all of the tribes, the head of all of the tribes. Well, that is the end of Lesson 10. This is a short lesson because we're leading up to a much longer lesson next week. I gave you an extra long lesson last week, and so I'm giving you a short lesson this week, and maybe that way you can catch up to where we are today. Next week we actually pick up with the story of Jephthah. And so be prepared for that. That would be chapter 11. And it actually goes all the way through chapter 12, verse 6. So beginning next week, chapter 11, all the way up through chapter 12, verse 6, and the story of Jephthah. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating in the class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got something out of it. May God bless and keep you in all your days. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, Amen.